So we're going to do introductions. I'll just introduce myself briefly and then give our panel a chance to introduce themselves as well. So I am Jen Wheeler. I am the Director of Teacher Professional Development and Curriculum at Street Law. Street Law, although we're a national or even global nonprofit, we are based in Silver Spring, and we've been involved deeply in the Maryland Civic Coalition and in just Maryland civic education in general. My work focuses on Street Law's deliberative discussion work, which is why I'm here. But I'm a former Baltimore City middle school teacher, a former debate coach, and a former staff member at the Baltimore Urban Debate League. And we're really lucky to have 4 teachers from 4 different school districts, along with 2 students, join us to share their thoughts during today's session. So I'm gonna kind of bounce around to them and ask them to introduce themselves. Teachers, we're gonna start with you all. If you can give your name, where and what you teach, your experience with deliberation of current controversial issues, and you don't need to go into like super specific details, but just why you were a good choice for this panel, because you were, and just anything else that you'd like to share. So we'll go ahead and start with Alec.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, I am Alec Livieratos. I'm the Social Studies Instructional Team Leader at Hammond High in Columbia, Maryland. This is my 15th year teaching, and I love it. I teach American government, AP currently, and micro macroeconomics. I've been using deliberations for about, I guess this would be my 3rd year in the classroom. Even though we're virtual this year, it's a little bit different, but it's been a great opportunity. I struggled for a long time finding how to best use something like a debate in a class. And when I found deliberations and got to be trained by Street Law, I decided to stick with it, and it hasn't gone wrong yet. I really enjoy the style, and the kids get a lot out of it.
Thanks, Alec. Just as a heads up, we didn't stack the panel with Street Law fans. So we'll go to someone who knows me from a different time into my life. We'll go to Kyair Butts, who is someone I used to work with when I was in Baltimore City Public Schools. Kyair, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure thing. My name is Kyair, and I know Jen through the Baltimore Urban Debate League. So by way of introduction again, my name is Kyair. Students call me Mr. K. I teach 6th grade language arts at Waverly. And again, that's in Baltimore City Public Schools. In 2019, I was surprised and won Teacher of the Year for Baltimore City Public Schools. So that was pretty cool. And in 2016, I won Coach of the Year for the Baltimore Urban Debate League. So I've been with Boodle since 2012, coaching students and also coaching coaches. I'm excited to be here and just engage in why discourse and discussion is really important in the classroom.
Yeah, thanks, Kyair. Jim, let's jump over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jim Rossi. I teach 7th grade social studies and coordinate the International Baccalaureate Middle Years program at Northern Middle School in Hagerstown, Maryland. So this is my 12th year in the classroom and my 6th year in Hagerstown. I spent time, oh, wrong Jim. Good grief. I'm sorry. Jen, can you hear me at all? I'm sorry. My first name is James, but I go by Jim sometimes. So I totally cut off our other panelist named Jim. So I'll stop talking now.
I don't think we have another panelist named Jim.
Oh, really? Oh, I saw another Jim come on the screen. And oh, there I am. All right. Hey, everybody. Well, this is awkward. Hi, so my name is Jim Rossi. I don't know if you heard all that, but I teach 7th grade social studies at Northern Middle School. All right, I said all that. So previously taught in Baltimore by way of Philadelphia. And I'm a member of this coalition, but I also am the one of 2 Maryland representatives to the Middle States Council for Social Studies. And I'm involved in the Ford's Theater Center for Education and Leadership oratory program as a master teacher. So that is essentially developing skills related to public speaking, critical thinking, developing rhetoric, civil and political discourse in our classrooms. And I've been a part of that program now for 9 years. And it's great to see everyone today. And thanks for putting up with me and my video woes.
Thanks, Jim. That was some good comic relief. I'm sure appreciated later in the day. Neha, let's go over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. So sorry about that. My computer audio is kind of weird, so I use my phone, but it is me on the screen. My name is Neha Singhal. I am a high school social studies teacher in Montgomery County Public Schools. And I'm trying to remember all of Jen's questions. What were some of your questions, Jen?
Yeah, so what's your experience with deliberation of current controversial issues?
Yes. Okay, that's right. Yeah, so I had the opportunity to be trained by street law a few years ago. I think it was maybe for the first batch of fellows for the street law program. And so it was totally up my alley. I've always done kind of controversial discussions in my classes. I've taught IB anthropology, government, US history, Latin American studies. So having kind of another tool around the way that street law was doing deliberations was just really great for me to try out as well. And then I guess the other reason I maybe was chosen was for the panel was just I gave a lot of feedback on some of the curriculum for the deliberations and kind of just some ideas with a lens towards kind of anti-oppressive pedagogy when thinking about deliberations.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. And we also are really lucky to have two students here with us, two students who are former students of Neha's. Students, when you introduce yourself, if you can give your name, and if you can also talk about why you think discussing current and controversial issues is important for young people. I think that that's kind of a good introduction. So Cam, let's start with you.
Hi, I am Cam, a graduating senior at John F. Kennedy. I took anthropology from Miss Singhal, an amazing teacher, by the way. I think it's really important that we talk about controversial issues in schools, not only because they might not be, most students aren't getting to actually have these discussions with adults in their life, but it also releases the tension and makes a student feel less ostracized if they're feeling a certain way about political issues and they have no one to talk about it with or no one who can share with them information or their personal life experiences. So it's really important that we're having this, and I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Cam. Nathalie, you want to go?
Hi, my name is Nathalie, and I'm also a former student of Ms. Singhal. I took her IB anthropology class, and it completely changed my life. I think it's really important to have these discussions first because I think it's kind of our duty to educate our students about, students about everything. And I think these types of discussions also form who we are as people as we grow older. So it's important that we form into good people, obviously, in society. So I think, having safe spaces where we can have these discussions without being judged or, like Cam said, ostracized, is important because we can really grow as people in classrooms. And that's exactly what happened to me in Ms. Singhal's class.
That's some amazing stories. I'm glad that you guys can both join us and that we're lucky to have your teacher here with us as well. So to get started with our questions, I think it's probably a good idea to start with sort of a definition question about what is deliberation. And to kind of lead us into that question, there is some kind of common knowledge about deliberation that I'll start the definition with, but then I'd love to hear folks add to or refine the definition of deliberation. So a deliberation is a discussion that's aimed at making a decision. In a deliberative discussion, participants engage in shared inquiry about what we should do to solve a community problem. For example, a deliberation might ask the question, should we abolish the Electoral College, which has been sort of a hot topic over these last several years. But there's lots of questions like that, right? So how would you add to or refine this definition? We could probably go on and on and on about the definition, but how would you add to or refine this definition of deliberation?
I can go first. I think to me, what separates deliberation from debate is the idea of finding common ground. And I think that's something that is often lost in our society. We're such a polarized, when it comes to media and politics right now, right? Finding common ground, when I would use a debate in the classroom wasn't always the goal, but with deliberations, it's looking for that common ground. And even if it's just acknowledging, hey, at the very least, we can agree this is a real problem in our society, and maybe we don't always agree on the solutions, but acknowledging that government or society needs to address it is a common area that we can find and agree with. So I think at the very least, that separates this style of addressing controversial issues rather than debating and trying to win. It's finding common ground, which I think is really important.
And really to add on, Alec, I think that's a great thing, right? From a from a stylistic standpoint, that really changes the mindset, right? So even when I'm working with debaters, this idea that it's really okay if we don't win, losing is okay too, because we're going to learn some lessons, right? And really, especially right now with the literacy curriculum in Baltimore, it's a knowledge building curriculum. So I try to treat debate as an extension of the knowledge building curriculum. Worst case scenario, we learn some stuff, right? Best case, you maybe go home with a trophy, but you also learn some stuff. But I would say that it's important to underscore that if it's, a deliberative discussion, and I'm kind of thinking about this, the idea is to come up with some sort of decision, also acknowledging that we're not always going to agree on the right path. To your point, Alec, if we can at least hopefully get students to see that it's okay to disagree without being disagreeable. There are certain tenets to me about being a good, reasonable, prudent person, right? Exercising some sense of decorum and civility. Those I want to come out of any sort of discussion: deliberative, persuasive, argumentative. To me, it's about, can we treat somebody else that we're talking with a sense of decency? That groundwork, I think, is incumbent upon teachers to do. I sort of heard that for sure in Nethely's answer and in Cam's answer, that the job of the teacher, the moderator, the facilitator, we have to kind of put down some of those tracks, because I think Cam was saying in her answer, not all students are coming to the classroom, in theory, safe space to empower yourself, with those sort of rules of decorum, right? We have the rules of the road before you get your license or your permit. To engage in a good conversation and to make sure that people feel invited and safe and empowered, teachers do need to make sure that there are some fundamentals. That could be discussion norms that are agreed upon or shared. You can call them working agreements, whatever it is. There has to be some buy-in, and there has to be safety, especially when SEL is of a pretty high import these days.
And I think, just to add on to what Kyair said, that the deliberation, the short definition here, deliberation is a discussion aimed at making a decision. Well, I would argue that process and reflecting on that process as a student, and reflecting on, like, well, which different avenues did I take to come to this decision? Did I even come to a decision? I think there is so much value and weight in that process, especially if we can back it up with authentic reflection. That I think that really, because sometimes in debate and deliberation, we rush to wanting to prove someone right or wrong, and in that rush to that end, we lose the process. And so I think that's a very valuable thing that I would add to that definition.
Anybody else want to add to that definition?
I wanted to say that I think it's important when you're having these like deliberative discussions that you kind of abolish like the mindset of right and wrong, because at the end of the day, like, you're gonna find new perspectives about certain issues that you might have not known before. So I don't think it's inherently right or wrong. I just think that it's a collective decision that needs to be brought together by an entire classroom or an entire group of people.
Neha, I see that you want to say something.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I just following up with everything everyone said. I really feel with the deliberation, the emphasis is more on the process than having this end goal. And I just really like how we can help students see that the process is just as important as the goal, right? I heard Kyair and others talking about this need to take care of oneself and each other when we are talking about controversial and difficult issues, because it can be triggering. It can be really difficult, especially if we're debating or discussing, deliberating something where people's literal lives, right, are on the line. And so I think really focusing on the process and really having students engage with one another, to me, I've seen to be super rewarding rather than just like kind of this end product. And I'll just say very quickly, when I did the hate speech specific deliberation with my government students, you know, a lot of them, more than kind of having a perfect kind of opinion on either side of, you know, should hate speech be banned, they were left with so much just greater insight into this topic, and something that they were continuing to deliberate, right? That it's like an ongoing process. So I just wanted to echo that piece, that the process is very urgent in terms of keeping everyone's humanity at the center.
Yeah, thanks, Neha. So I think this was sort of brought up a little bit, like in comparing deliberative discussion to other styles of discussion, but just to kind of add a little bit to this conversation about what makes deliberation worthwhile. Teachers have lots of choices. We all have lots of choices about the way that we want to engage in discussion, the structure of our discussion. And so then it becomes this question of why deliberation. Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy in their book, The Political Classroom, have done research on this to say that high quality discussions like this that are deliberative lead students to be more politically engaged, that lead students to be more understanding of the nuances of policy issues. Students are more interested in current events, and students are more comfortable with disagreement. I think some of those speak to that idea of process mattering more than the end result, that you know, at the end of the day, we might not have a final consensus among, you know, the 30 students in our class, but we do better understand one another. We are more comfortable with knowing that there's disagreement, which I think is something that is lacking maybe in political discourse, perhaps outside of the classroom, but probably inside some classrooms as well. So you heard Neha and Alec, I think, maybe bring up some topics of discussion. And this, I think, might be a logical next step in thinking about current and controversial issues. And I wanted to start with the students for this one, to ask the question, what current and controversial topics are you most interested in discussing, and why? What really speaks to you right now is something that you'd like to talk about, that maybe you've talked about in your class already, but maybe your teachers haven't brought it up and you'd like to talk about it too.
Personally, I would like to discuss what happened at the Capitol, only because, well, not just because it's important, but also it really speaks to white supremacy in the country, which is a topic that should be discussed, as a lot of peers that I know don't believe it's an actual thing, which if we don't really talk about it, then we can't help, you know, other students come to this conclusion of how to actually move throughout the country. Because like as students, you're preparing us so we can go into the world and, you know, face it and hopefully change it, but we can't do that if we don't know how it works. So it's important that we talk about current events and how they go hand in hand with systemic issues.
I think going off of what Cam said, the Capitol insurrection, along with, I think, the impeachment trial right now, or the former impeachment trial, I think it's important to discuss situations like that just to understand also systemic issues in society and like overall analysis of how our government works, in the sense like, you know, why was Trump acquitted, stuff like that. So in my classes, at least, no one really like brought it up aside from the already like studying like those subject classes. So like anthropology brought it up, but my other classes really didn't do much to talk about it or address it. So it was this really like white silence the next day. And it was just like deafening, because I mean, like this huge thing just happened, but no one's really talking about it or addressing it. And it's just like, well, did it happen? Is it not as big as a deal as I thought it was? So like, I think when ignoring situations like that, it perpetuates just like assuming that it's not as important as other issues in society. And that's super dangerous as well. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask an off the cuff question that Nepal, you brought up that in some classes, these issues were being addressed, but not in others. And that still felt like kind of that idea of white silence, that if it's not being addressed in multiple classes, that it doesn't feel like it's enough. So what role should non-social studies teachers, because I think that a lot of folks think that social studies teachers are the ones that need to do this, and I don't need to think about this because I'm a math teacher or I'm an English teacher. So what role should non-social studies teachers play in deliberation of current controversial issues? And this can go to any of our panelists and to the chat too.
Oh, I mean, so like I would say that by way of anecdote, our team came together and we talked that night, sort of as the events that Nathalie and Cam were talking about on the 6th were unfolding. The team of 6th grade teachers at my particular at my school, we were discussing, we need to address this. You know, there was a lot of kind of consideration around sort of the what and the how, but there was no debate. Is that a pun at all at this point? Or deliberating, you could say. Well, anyways, there was no real thinking behind whether or not we were going to. We knew that we wanted to address the topic. There was more deliberation around how and what. I came back to the team and we had a lot that was mostly putting stuff out there for students to see visuals, see what had been tweeted on sort of both sides of the political spectrum from various people, clips to watch. And it was not meant to showcase teachers and our opinions, but rather as a sort of median facilitator of the discussion itself. You know, I know that students a lot of times want to know where their teachers stand on issues, because I would respectfully say that to some extent, maybe how you lean or some of the issues over the last 4 years, that stuff probably saliently comes out in terms of mindset and maybe disproportionate actions for students. So to some extent, it is important for teachers to go through this, but there's a lot of, I'm going to compare it to an octopus. There's a lot of like tentacles here that have their, you know, that are wrapped around something. You know, we can sit here and kind of say, yeah, it's important to engage in this. Students want these issues. But I would also argue that if we're talking about DEI, right, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, just equity work in general, these are very personal journeys that people have to willingly and actively engage in. It's almost like, I hate to compare DEI to a car tune-up, but your car's got to go in and get an oil change. Folks need to engage in professional development and personal development and consistently seek out ways to better themselves through equity and just understanding. And students, you said that white silence in your classroom is deafening. And to some extent, teachers letting it persist, my personal opinion is now we are complicit in pushing the deafening. I swear I'm an English teacher, but that silence does become pervasive, and then it's persisting, right? This isn't the space for me to give my TED talk, but I'll wrap up the soliloquy by saying it's important for teachers to have an understanding of their own racial identity. There's racial and equity work that teachers have to do. So part of it, students, could be honestly that your teachers are afraid and that they don't know how to engage. And that's a valid feeling. Not engaging to me is not okay, but recognizing that there might be some fear at play and we have to check our own biases and how can we engage, that is really meaningful. And sometimes that means breaking the fourth wall and using that sort of empathy capital with your students and saying, you know, class, Mr. K is really not quite sure what to say. I know that something should be said because I do feel something, but I'm also a little afraid too because I don't know how for the first time to present you with something. You'd be surprised that you're going to get a little bit of love and some respect from your students by just saying, I don't know how to engage, but I want to. Because guess what? Your students also might not know, but they want to.
Yeah, I think another, you know, I'm very lucky to work in a school with an incredibly supportive principal that wants us to do this work and allows us as social studies teachers to have these conversations. That's not the case in all schools. And I think, your teachers might want to have this conversation, but their principals might be saying to them, don't have this conversation, because I can't have my phone blowing up all day long when I have a bunch of other things to deal with. And I think that is such a travesty, because I'm going to quote Marcy Taylor Toma in our previous breakout room. She says, classrooms are the labs of democracies. And when we just ignore it and we just sweep it under the rug, it speaks to everything that our students here are talking about, but it also speaks to the health of this country. And by just sweeping it away so our phones don't blow up, there are teachers that feel that pressure, not only from internal, but also from the people that control their salaries and whether they get to keep their job.
Yeah, I love that. Classrooms are like the labs of democracy. That's amazing. I want that bumper sticker. And, I would hope, I would just add a couple of things to what I'm hearing. One thing that I was thinking about in terms of, like all teachers should be civics teachers, not just folks who teach government, right? One way that I can see just very practically how it would be so helpful for me when I talk about white supremacy in anthropology, when I talk about it in US government, in terms of how the Constitution was written, how the country was, founded, right? In U.S. history class, when we talk about genocide and slavery and just everything, right? I'm shocked that, we still, in our science classes, like there is so much rich discussion and curriculum needed in our science classes to address scientific racism and the way in which pseudoscience has been used to prop up white supremacy, like even now. And I think that that's just like right for some amazing curricula and intervention to create in biology class and, really all science classes, to have like robust classes where students are both in government class, like learning about how, the Constitution was written with a white supremacist framework, and then also going to science class and being like, hey, at that time, the founding fathers also believed in race science, and they perpetuated these very racist ideas and used fake science. So let's, in 2021, not be fooled, y'all. Like, there are still journals that, put out fake science out there, right? And there are still news media that put out fake, news also. So I think like that is like a concrete way that I really wish I had support as a social studies teacher from science fields, not to like blame any teacher, but just from the science institution, I guess, is like, why can't we talk about white supremacy in that field? Is like, to me, it's so prominent.
I just wanted to go off of what Ms. Singhal said. I completely agree. I think that civic education exists in every single subject. I don't think that it's limited to just a US government class or a social anthropology class. There are certain things that like, you can, obviously you're gonna teach with a little bit of bias. Everyone is a little bit biased, but I think allowing students to form their own beliefs after being educated about the proper facts of what actually took place or actually went down, I think that's super important. Like Ms. Singhal was saying, biology class. Obviously, there are certain controversial issues like pro-choice and pro-life, but those issues can be addressed in classes like biology, learning how a cell forms, when it's considered life. But I think there's this fear of just being so controversial that you don't want to get in an argument or in a debate. But I think those debates need to be had in order to see the full perspective of both sides. And, people can make their own thoughts up about a certain issue after they've had the full perspective on their entire plate and they can see everything. And I think that's super important. But I feel like it isn't limited to just civic classes. It shouldn't be just talked about in social anthropology or history class about how systemic racism exists. It should be talked about in economics about how there are economic disparities in racial groups and how capitalism is extremely racist. And there's a whole bunch of things you can talk about in math, statistics, study racial disparities again. There's so many ways. And I'm in IB diploma, so I have focused all of my IAs, all of my internal assessments on social issues. So in math, I'm talking about how racial demographics affected the 2020 presidential election. And in biology, I'm talking about how certain countries are affected with extreme poverty and health issues because of the certain types of rice that's given to them. So it's like, it's insane possibilities for each subject, and it shouldn't be limited to just a social anthropology class.
I think you have someone's trying to recruit you to the University of Maryland in the chat, Nathalie.
I am.
So, Jim, something that you brought up made me think about a workshop that I did with Paula McAvoy around ethical dilemmas in teaching. That teachers are presented with ethical choices, and sometimes those choices mean listening to or hearing a policy and saying, no, I can't follow that policy. Or hearing that guidance that says, I don't want you to talk about January 6th, and saying, I have to talk about January 6th. That obviously overlaps with these types of current and controversial discussions, whether they're really fresh or whether they've been going on for a long time. I think Nathalie brought up the abortion debate. So I'm curious about, what do you think it takes for a teacher to be able to make that ethical decision? What are teachers weighing as they make those decisions? How does, maybe I'll just stop there. What are they weighing? And you guys can kind of riff off of that, I guess.
I think one thing, and I don't know, if I start to sidestep this question, please stop me. But I think like something to consider, like, okay, you're not allowed to talk about January 6th, right? And if I reply, well, I want to, you can't. Well, I want to, right? So we have to justify why it is or how we are going to talk about this in an organized and structured way. So I think for my middle school classroom, there's a real, you can really see when protocols are utilized well in the classroom. And if the first time you're doing a discussion, whether it's a Socratic seminar or philosophical chairs, if the first time you're doing that is to talk about January 6th, you're already in hot water, right? Because this is something that should have been building throughout the course of your year. It could be a philosophical chairs on the student cell phone policy that you do on the first day back to school, right? Because these are skills. We had I believe it was John King said earlier about driving a car, right? Like you have to practice to drive a car. You have to practice to have civil discourse. If the first time we're going to try civil discourse is the impeachment trial, not going to work. So I think my answer would be like, I don't want you to talk about January 6th. Well, with all due respect, Principal so-and-so, we've been preparing for this all year long. And we've developed these tools, and please come in and sit down and watch the kids run the show. Watch the students run the show, because as we are all seeing right now, our students have way more of the answers than we give them credit for. So that would be sort of my approach to that situation.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think something too is, as teachers, knowing your students, right? Knowing your learners and building the relationship and the foundation of trust to be able to have those hard conversations about current events. We got a memo not to talk about it, and I couldn't not. And it was probably our most powerful day together in semester one, was talking about January 6th. And frankly, most of that time I just muted and listened, and I didn't know what to say a lot of the time. So, but I knew my students needed to talk, and I knew them well enough to say they're hurting, they have questions, and they need to be able to process in a safe space. So going back to Jen, your question, I think knowing your students and knowing what, when they need to vent, when they need to talk about something, knowing what they're interested in, what they're passionate about. If you know those things about your students, you can have great deliberation and great discussion. Rules be damned.
Yeah, I also agree. Also, I think in thinking about the question, there's a lot to think about. I wholeheartedly agree with what Jim was saying. Protocols, procedures, absolutely. Alec, of course, there's this idea that if you know your students well, you follow the protocols, for the most part, I think that it should go well. I think what ends up happening, and this is sort of like my own truth and vulnerability with all of you, is, I'm even thinking about the debate league, and we had a topic last year about I think something along the lines of defunding the police and police brutality. This year we're talking about reparations, and to me, the fear comes from adults, and then we project those fears onto Nethalie and Cam, and the rest of our students and adults think that our kids can't engage in this. So this is where Jim is saying, well, principal so and so is worried about getting that mountain of calls. The principal's fearful, not that we can't do our jobs, but they're just fearful that something is bad going to happen in the classroom, and that they've got to sort of CYA, right, cover your butt. And they kind of don't want that, because that's not the fire that they want to put out that day. So fear, again, and I'm sure we all know this, it drives us to do wild things, even if we know, sort of like capital R, that it's the right thing to do objectively to engage in this, democracy, right? In this sort of laboratory of democracy, and exist as good people. So that's one part, I think, Jen, is fear. It takes a little bit of courage. Sometimes teachers have to subvert. There's a really good article about masterful teachers engaging in just sort of little acts of subversion. Now, Jim, I think a lot of teachers might agree that maybe as the first year teacher, you don't really throw caution to the wind and say, bam, I'm doing this, and we're going to use January 6th. But I do think that masterful teachers do have to find ways to subvert, because objectively it's the right thing to do. I'll also say that you're weighing, what do your students want to know versus what do your students need to know? Your students want to know a lot of things. Sort of as the adult, or as I like to think of myself, look, I'm your school dad for right now. What do I want my kid to walk away knowing for the time that they're with me? I know that there's things that they want to know, and we can definitely address it. But what do I need my kid to know in order to address those goals that we talked about at the beginning of the school year? The last thing I'll end with, in terms of going back to what you said, Jim, about protocols and procedures, I'm all about students understanding what their rights are in my class are, what their role is, and what their responsibility is, right? Like, you have a right to be heard, but you also have a responsibility to hear and listen, right? You have the right to be seen and to be valued. But you got to be able to exercise that too with others. So as much as I am about the process and the procedure and the protocol, rights, roles, and responsibilities are key in my classroom. If you understand those, we can definitely engage in this discourse.
Yeah, another thing I'll add to that, and I could be wrong about this, but another fear that I have seen from teachers for not wanting to facilitate these discussions is, I don't know if it's fear maybe, but it's like not knowing how to address disagreement, or not knowing how to address triggers, or racism or sexism. And I've been in spaces, and I'm sure many of you have been in spaces, where something horrifically sexist or racist was said, and it went unchecked, and it was very hurtful as a participant or a student in that space. And so for me as a teacher, I've always vowed to make sure that when I facilitate a conversation, a deliberation, that I facilitate it actively. And what I mean by that is, if something racist is said, right, that needs to be addressed in the conversation. If something sexist is said, that needs to be addressed by, I believe, first the students, right, if that's possible. And if the students don't feel equipped to do that because they are so offended or triggered, then it needs to be the facilitator, right? And I think that's something that is lacking in our training for teacher development also. And I see that folks putting that in the chat, right? Like, we also need to empower teachers to say, hey, you are allowed to step in. You're not neutral, right? Neutrality is oppressive. You are allowed to step in, and you are also allowed to address when and if something racist is said. And I'll give you an example, actually. When I had this Jan 6 discussions in my US history class, by the way, it fit perfectly because we were just talking about mob violence, white mob violence in this country historically, particularly the lynch mobs, and how historically also there was much leniency, police colluded, right? Like, and now we see the same thing happen. But anyway, somehow the conversation got derailed, and a student made this remark about how, well, it's easy for Hispanic students to get into college. It got very derailed, guys, the conversation. And the student said this, and to be honest, like I was triggered. I had to like take a step back, and I was like, oh my goodness, what is happening right now on Zoom, right? But you know, students, of course, you know, they said things also in the moment, and I also addressed it in the moment. Plus, the next day, I had a second discussion about it also, right? I talked to students about like, how does it make somebody who is Hispanic or a person of color feel if somebody were to say that it's easier to get into college, right? And let's look at the fact. Let's actually look at kind of what's happening in our country. Let's talk about affirmative action. So a part of it also is, I think, like teachers need to be able to address things on the spot and on the fly. And if students are constantly like saying something that's racist or sexist or whatever, like that needs to be addressed in the classroom, and there should be follow-up also. So I think, Jim, you were talking about this, like we should always have these, they should be normalized, not just like after something big happens. And then we also need to have the follow-up to check in with students after, especially heated conversations about how folks are doing, how did it make them feel. I like individually texted like almost all of my students after that class to see how folks were doing, because I was just like, oh my goodness. But that's our job, I think, as teachers, is we have to kind of be in this uncomfortable position, but be vulnerable. I was very vulnerable with the students. I was like, y'all, oh my, okay, let me take a pause right now, because what is happening?
Yeah. Thanks, Neha. I think that hearing that very specific example is really helpful. You know, you often hear that a teacher should check this, but then you know, for folks who are inexperienced with what it means to check sexism or racism during a discussion or just during the class, having that extra, you know, having the example is really helpful. And I think someone wrote in the chat, bring on the professional development. When I was teaching, there were certain things that just would pop into my mind because it was so routine to do them. And I think that's a place that we want teachers to get to when it comes to actively facilitating these conversations, is that it's routine to stop a conversation when something really harmful is said, and that teachers are comfortable doing that, and they know what to say, and they know how to follow up with that. But that takes work. That's not something that, you know, we're born knowing how to do or not. So we've got a few minutes for some questions that were submitted in the chat, and one question that I'd like to ask comes from Kira, and it's a question about bringing these types of conversations to elementary students, which I think often, you know, I heard in the civics course panel that Leah Renzi led, a lot of the panelists were talking about just how important it is for civics to happen at a very young age, and that carries through. But often these conversations are not, these types of conversations that we're talking about are not necessarily happening in elementary school. So what, Kira asked, what suggestions do you have for teachers? How can we make these difficult topics accessible and developmentally appropriate for elementary school students? And Kyair, I know that you are an elementary teacher, so I want to give you the first grab if you want to take it.
Yeah, so I really, honestly, I would just sort of echo what I had said earlier. I would say that you do want to, and this is kind of building up, right? Like, I think that you do want to talk with your students about rights that they have and what their role is, again, in the classroom in that discussion. You could, you know, and it's kind of getting back to what Neha was saying, right, about how to address, you know, the disagreements in the classroom. If you do hear something that is sort of like cringy in the classroom, I know I do a race and equity course with Johns Hopkins, and the grad students themselves decided that they would use the word ouch and literally interrupt somebody when harm was done while they were speaking, and they would say ouch. And then we would, after class, they would go through what's called a clearing protocol. Now, am I expecting, you know, your fourth grade students, you know, to, you know, hey, you know, I know that I harmed you today, maybe, and I know that fourth graders could do that. But again, like Jim was saying, this is really building. I would, however, start with students, again, understanding that there are going to be some ground rules, right? About we want to hear everybody, make sure that you are also heard. We want to value those voices. Try to keep that maybe to like 3 to 4. One, so that you could also just call out a number, you know, if you happen to see maybe that community ruler, working agreement being violated that you can just refer to it by number any more than 3 or 4, and it's really tough. And my Dory, like mine, kind of starts to get warped at some point. So start there with just an understanding of working agreements and ground rules, if you will. When we talked about the civil unrest, again, we spent a lot of time going through those 4, what examples of that meant, students coming on the mic. Baltimore City is still virtual, so we had a firm understanding of what that was, and probably took us 20 minutes into an hour or so long class before we even talked and addressed that. Then we spent a lot of time unpacking this definition that history in the United States has very rarely ever been sort of peaceful, and just kind of going through what sort of whitewashing has looked like historically. So students understand that term. Students understood sort of what white supremacy meant. And then, like I said, it was just a series of images, and all we had students do was engage in noticing and wondering. What do you notice about the images that you're seeing? What do you notice about the tweets? What do you wonder about what you're seeing? And what do you wonder about the tweets or whatever like snippet that we had gathered? We tried to go through a lot of different news sources, right news sources, if you will, and, left media, so that students had a pretty good gamut. But the discussion was really driven by what do you notice and what do you wonder? We also did compare what students saw on the 6th to how Black Lives Matter was treated over the summer, and a lot of those movements, and who some of those instigators and sort of people that were, really instigating violence, and who that was and who it also wasn't. And students were able to sort of draw their own conclusions. Teachers would step in and fact check if it crossed the line, or if sort of a carte blanche statement was being made. We absolutely stepped in to correct, because it's one thing for someone to make a statement that, because I teach mostly to all Black kids, makes, but I also don't want you to go around thinking this untruth. Like, that's my job's also not to let your feelings dictate bad facts, right? We still have a job to do when it comes to facts. And believe it or not, facts are a stubborn thing, even if they haven't always persisted that way. Yeah, anyways, I could talk forever about how to do that, but Kira or anyone else, start with images, start with some ground rules, and really refine that protocol. And honestly, let your students be the driver. You should be stepping in to correct harm if it's done, and to address if there's a misrepresentation of the facts.
So I think we could probably talk about this a lot longer. All our panelists know that I sent them about 15 questions, and we've probably answered 2 of them. It's unfortunate that we didn't get to some of those other questions and some of the guest questions, but we do now have an opportunity to continue the conversation in the breakout rooms. I want to thank our Roundtable participants for joining us, especially after what's, I'm sure, been a long day of teaching and learning for all of you. And thank you, everyone who's joined us today, for your engagement, your thoughtful comments and questions. As we transition to breakout rooms, you can see the discussion questions that are now posted on the screen. Thinking about things that resonated with you, thinking about what you agreed with, disagreed with, have questions about what resources you might use to bring deliberation of current and controversial issues into your classrooms, but certainly don't limit it to these questions. We didn't limit our panel to the questions that we'd written out, and it went, I think, to really good places and really thoughtful places. So with that, I think I'll let, I think it's John, move everyone to breakout rooms, and hopefully we'll get a chance to drop in and listen in and chat with you all as well. Thank you.